So, today I want to talk about how Pfizer is exploiting countries with the vaccine. Due to the way that international intellectual property laws function, Pfizer, as a private company, has complete control of one of the best tools in the world to combat a global pandemic and limit the devastation and spread of COVID 19. This vaccine and all of the other ones like it are essential to saving lives globally. And yet, it has been put in the hands of a for profit institution to control who gets to have it and who does not. A for profit institution, I might add, that has received over $445 million in public money from the German government and received over $2 billion in promises from the United States in exchange for 600 million doses of the vaccine. Many nations from across the globe have advocated that vaccine companies have their intellectual property rights waived, as is currently done with the flu vaccine, in order to preserve the health and safety of people and put people over profit in such trying times. When it comes to the flu vaccine, the way that it's handled is that the World Health Organization pools its resources in order to make sure that the flu does not get spread globally. Quite similarly, we could do the same thing with COVID. Unfortunately, this has gone widely ignored by the wealthiest nations on the planet in favor of allowing these private companies such as Pfizer to continue to make record-breaking profits off of something that has the potential to save lives, stop the spread of a disease, and was widely paid for with public money. The issue around a private company holding such a life-saving vaccine should be apparent, as they can effectively use their own vaccine as leverage and in order to negotiate any sort of terms with anybody who needs it. The price of life is essentially infinite, and these companies know it. And Pfizer, of course, has the capacity, by controlling the intellectual property rights on this particular vaccine, to negotiate on their own terms with any country that wants to get access to it. Now we are in the place where all of the fears that I just described are starting to manifest and come true, as we have evidence to show that Pfizer has been doing just that. We have access to some of the contracts that they've had with a lot of the different nations in the globe. And these nations, of course, need the vaccine, so, of course, they have to capitulate to Pfizer's terms. We have here a document or describing some of the information that exists in these contracts from Public Citizen, an organization that is highlighting this type of situation. Now, the contracts offer a rare glimpse into the power one pharmaceutical corporation has gained to silence governments, throttle supply, shift risk, and maximize profits in the worst public health crisis in a century. And that's worth remembering. We are in one of the worst public health crises in a century, and people are making money off of this. We should be trying to invest to try to make sure that people's lives are saved. The goal of something like this, of this global endeavor to make sure people are safe, should be in fact done to keep people safe, not to put money and concentrate it into the hands of a company. Now, when we go through this, right now I have on screen a listing of all of the different contracts that were reviewed by Public Citizen. And you have countries like Albania, Brazil, Colombia, Chile, Dominican Republic, the European Commission, Peru, the United States, and the United Kingdom. There are, of course, more contracts on the table, but these are the ones that they got their hands on. And so they go through a lot of the key features of them because all of these documents are extensive, some of them in the 90-plus page range. So I want to briefly go through some of their findings and just talk a little bit about that. We have here that Pfizer reserves the right to silence governments. In January, the Brazilian government complained that Pfizer was insisting on contractual terms in negotiations that were, quote, unfair and abusive. Now, the fact of the matter is, they had to come back to the table. If I'm understanding correctly, Brazil actually had opted to leave negotiations, but of course they had to come back because they need access to the vaccine for their people. Now, Brazil actually had to waive sovereign immunity, imposed no penalties on Pfizer for late deliveries, and agreed to resolve all disputes under a secret private arbitration under the laws of New York, and broadly indemnified Pfizer for civil claims. So now, according to that contract, Pfizer is immune to civil claims. All of the laws have to be handled from Pfizer's position in New York because they're a Manhattan-based company, if I'm understanding all of this correctly. And basically, Brazil no longer is able to remove their own sovereign immunity. effectively making it so that they can be sued by Pfizer for assets. Meaning that in all of this, Brazil has lost all of their power to Pfizer to control their own country in these negotiations and contracts. The Brazilian government is prohibited as well from making any public announcements concerning the existence, subject matter, or terms of the agreement, or commenting on its relationship with Pfizer without prior written consent from the company. Meaning, if they want to talk with their own people about what's been happening, or they want to disclose this within their country and within their borders about what's gone on in this contract and reveal their position in it, they're legally not allowed to do so without the express written consent of Pfizer, meaning that they've effectively been silenced. They cannot in any way speak out against what's going on here. Now, it is worth noting that Brazil is not alone, as a similar non-disclosure provision is contained in the Pfizer contract with both the European Commission and the US government. However, they apply to both parties, meaning that the US cannot speak about Pfizer, but Pfizer cannot speak on the US government's contract. Meanwhile, when it comes to smaller nations like Brazil, Pfizer can say whatever it wants. It's only Brazil that's silenced. And that's the type of power that Pfizer has in these negotiations when they have the backing of wealthy, powerful nations, who of course are upholding all of these intellectual property right laws. Now, when we move on, we find that Pfizer actually controls donations, and this one to me is absolutely frustrating and disturbing. We have a situation in the world globally where a country like the United States may not be able to utilize all of its vaccines. We ordered 600 million. A lot of people have refused to take it. And even if we end up using boosters, there might be a great number of them that are widely available that could be handed to other countries. Probably what should have been done earlier on. But if those vaccines are in fact available, according to Pfizer, those vaccines, if they're accepted by another country that they have a negotiation and contract with, might actually be violating the terms and put them at a disadvantage. We have here that the Brazilian government, for example, is restricted from accepting Pfizer vaccine donations from other countries or buying Pfizer vaccines from others without Pfizer's permission, meaning that they have to go specifically through Pfizer, ask for permission in order to receive a donation of that vaccine. The Brazilian government also is restricted from donating, distributing, exporting, or otherwise transporting the vaccine out of Brazil without Pfizer's permission, meaning that Pfizer still owns the vaccine, it owns all the dosages, and Brazil isn't actually buying it, just the license to use it. If Brazil were to accept any sort of donated dosages without Pfizer's permission, it would be considered a, quote, uncurable material breach of their agreement, allowing Pfizer to immediately terminate the agreement, and upon termination, Brazil would be required to pay the full price for any remaining contracted doses. And that again is also worth talking about. The fact that Pfizer can just cut it off because they feel like it, because they didn't get all of their terms completely represented, that basically all of the people in Brazil that went unvaccinated could essentially be put in a position where they're no longer able to get access to the Pfizer vaccine. Can you imagine if people had a single dose and then Brazil does something that upsets Pfizer and then people aren't able to get the second dose that's required? This is the kind of thing that could potentially happen simply for the way the contracts have been negotiated. And again, all of the powers in Pfizer's courts, they get to determine everything. In fact, they even get to determine the courts like we talked about. And of course, Brazil would still have to pay up. Now, in addition to all of this, I'm going to skip 3 and come right back to it. But when we come down here, the private arbitration aspect of this is something really important with what we just read. Now, it's worth noting again that when we talk about the fact that Brazil would have to pay full price, a lot of the countries involved actually were put in a position where they would also be, again, under New York law, but if they failed, Pfizer can actually go after state assets, meaning that if Brazil were to somehow break the contract, Pfizer requires Brazil, Chile, Colombia, and the Dominican Republic and Peru to waive sovereign immunity, which we mentioned. In the case of Brazil, Chile, and Colombia, for example, the government expressly and irrevocably waives any rights of immunity which either it or its assets may have or acquire in the future. For Brazil, Chile, and Colombia and the Dominican Republic, this includes immunity against precautionary seizure of any assets. So if Brazil defaults, they might have to have their assets seized by Pfizer to pay for this if they refuse to pay for something they're not getting. So that's ridiculously absurd. And that's why I bounced down to that area. But when we come back up, it's worth noting as well that when it comes to the intellectual property rights, Pfizer only cares about it when it benefits them. The CEO of Pfizer actually called the voluntary World Health Organization effort to share the intellectual property in order to bolster vaccine production nonsense and dangerous. Now, I mentioned this a little bit in the introduction, but what essentially happened is a lot of countries got together and tried to appeal to say the intellectual property rights here should be waived. And the reason for this is so that other countries could start to get access to creating their own vaccines, building their own plants, and that Pfizer and Moderna and some of the other companies involved across the world could help assist in setting that up and could be paid for their service in that regard. And then countries would be able to mass produce and manufacture vaccine in mass in a much quicker fashion so that it didn't take years for the vaccine to be distributed, but maybe only months. And that would allow for less variants of the virus to develop, and because the vaccine would be distributed faster. But of course, that was considered nonsensical and dangerous. In the meantime, Pfizer has basically said that in at least 4 countries that they have to defend and hold Pfizer as harmless in any lawsuits, claims, actions, demands, damages, or costs if they in any way violate vaccine intellectual property rights. Meaning, if they in any way, shape, or form infringe on any sort of property rights in the countries that they are negotiated with, the governments themselves are liable, not Pfizer. The Colombian government, for example, would actually have to foot the bill, and at Pfizer's request, Colombia is required to defend the company, i.e., take legal actions and proceedings to defend Pfizer. They literally have these countries in a place where they have to defend the company that's extorting them. That is ridiculous and that is absurd. Meanwhile, internationally, Pfizer is fighting these similar efforts to waive IP barriers for all manufacturers. So if a company in Colombia has a manufacturing license over some component, Pfizer can come in, waive it, and if the company sues, they sue the Colombian government. They do not sue Pfizer. And again, intellectual property rights are convenient when it serves the interests of Pfizer, but nobody else. We go back into talking about arbitrations and stuff like that, the Albania draft contract, again, makes it so that New York law functions for most of these countries. And that, again, puts all of the legal precedents in Pfizer's court. They control the law. They get to control what laws apply. And in many cases, private arbitration reflects an imbalance in this case of power. It's pharmaceutical corporations like Pfizer get to bypass domestic legal processes and destroy the autonomy of these nations in order to consolidate corporate power and undermining the rules of laws established in individual and sovereign nations. Meanwhile, Pfizer, again, can go after state assets like we talked about. And if you have it set up that basically the New York law applies, which of course Pfizer has direct access to and knows in and out because their lawyers all come out of Manhattan, and they're able to basically set it up so that all of the countries, like I described before, do not have any sort of sovereign immunity. What's basically going to happen if the companies end up defaulting in any way, shape, or form, they have to pay Pfizer in assets. That could include all sorts of guarantees, including, I don't know, lakes, rivers, anything that Pfizer wants. They have the right to claim it in order to get themselves reimbursed. Pfizer also calls the shot in all key decision-making processes. For example, in South Africa, Pfizer wanted to have the sole discretion to determine additional terms and guarantees to fulfill obligations, meaning that if anything needed to be changed, if they needed to add any additional terms, they could add it at will. Now, South Africa was fortunate in that they were able to push back against that. However, other countries have not been as successful. And if Pfizer doesn't hold up their end, or vaccine supply shortages are in some way, shape, or form preventing the vaccine from getting in, they haven't violated the contract in the least. Meanwhile, the Colombian government is required to demonstrate in a manner satisfactory to suppliers that suppliers and their affiliates will have adequate protection as determined in the supplier's sole discretion from liability claims, meaning that Pfizer gets to determine their own liability claims. If they did anything wrong, if they messed up the manufacturing process, if they cause harm to people because they themselves mess up something in the manufacturing process, they're not liable. And the fact of the matter is, when it comes to all of this, Pfizer is essentially immune and is getting all of the terms in their own favors and can extract all of these positions from these governments. And they will make money, they will make profit, and essentially these governments have no say in the matter and can have their assets stripped and can't even talk about it. So, with all of this, we have to recognize that all of this was actually predicted in the earliest parts of the pandemic. The World Health Organization and all of the nations that make it up tried to stop this and tried to get all of these intellectual property rights waived. But since they weren't, and a lot of the wealthiest nations ended up backing it, here we are, and here we have it. We can now see exactly what happens when you have a for-profit model control as like a company in this case, like Pfizer, and have exclusive control over something that people need for their survival. And medicine is far from the only time that we see this. If you've checked out my other videos, you've seen me talk about this in a lot of different other components. If you put people under, a position where they need to do something to survive, they will be much more controlled and much more willing to do it. If you put their food, medicine, and rent in some sort of situation where they're at risk, they're willing to do more in order to survive. And that's why we can't have things like universal health care. That's why we can't have things like universal housing rights, because companies won't be able to control people and manipulate them as well. And again, this happens here with Pfizer, and entire countries having to bend to the will of Pfizer in order for them to get access to survival medication for their populations. And they will use this, Pfizer, for the ability to gain power, extort from other countries, and just like any other instance, like I mentioned, where exclusive control of a resource is given to an organization whose primary motivating factor is not people, but money. The extent that Pfizer has gone to potentially force entire countries to put their assets on the line, make it sure that payments have to be received, and if they're not, they can seize assets, in addition to the ability to both silence and control the arbitration processes, gives them an absurd amount of control and power over entire nations. Again, it needs to be said that this vaccine is life-saving. It should have been distributed globally much earlier, and it should have been allowed to be produced globally without the use of these intellectual property rights since the beginning of the pandemic. Instead, this is where we are, and people are going to suffer for it. And the back end of all of this might be that new variants spawn that end up circumventing a lot of these vaccines and put us all back at square one. And then Pfizer will have most of the ability, like Moderna and all the rest, to start to produce another vaccine, which only nets them more profit in the end. And who will fit the bill? It'll probably be the public spending of a lot of the wealthier nations. The United States and Germany will probably be two of the biggest proponents of having to fund it, and if it's not spread globally, it'll just repeat on itself. So with that said, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button and the bell for notifications. You can follow me on Twitter and check out my Discord in the description down below. My name is Anarchist Tara, and I thank you for watching.